Word. Strengthen us in our faith as we study your word, helping us see the way you care for us. For Jesus' sake, amen. All right, Daniel 11. We got as far as verse 13 last week. So starting with verse 14, Daniel 11. Now, kind of a quick run through with where we are. An angel has appeared to Daniel, a powerful angel, and is now telling Daniel what the future will hold for him and for the children of Israel and for all God's people, as we'll find out. And the angel is giving Daniel one of a unique insight into the future that really there is no other parallel in all of Scripture like this. In that, the detail this angel is giving of what's going to lie in the future is truly amazing. There's just no other place in the Bible where the sort of detail with this king is going to do that and this is how it's going to be resolved, right down to the countries and names involved. This doesn't happen anywhere else. So this is a unique prophecy. And it may seem a bit tedious to go through and look at some of the history involved, but it is God's revelation to Daniel, and it does serve important purposes. So we're kind of in the same boat this week as we were last week with some of these historical facts and details that the angel is revealing. So verse 14, and in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also certain violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. Now there are two kingdoms which we have seen that the angel is telling Daniel about. And this is another unique thing about this prophecy. This is like the only prophecy in the Bible that covers these characters and this period of time. So we're talking right now at this point, the 200s BC, which is roughly 250 plus years in the future from where Daniel is receiving these visions or this instruction. The king of the south is Egypt, and the Egyptian dynasty that rose up after Alexander the Great. It's the Ptolemy dynasty. And every one of those Egyptian emperors is named Ptolemy. Ptolemy 1 through 8. There's 8 of them. And they have an Egyptian-sounding name, and they are ruling Egypt, but they're Greek. It's weird. It's Greek heritage, Macedonian heritage. So even Cleopatra, that name, Greek queen, she's not really Greek either. She's Syrian. So Egypt at this point in time, there are native Egyptians, which make up a big part of the population, general population, but the leadership of the country are all foreigners. And it's going to create real problems for them politically, as the angel is going to talk about. But Egypt is the king of the south, and the king of the north is the king of the Syrian, or Seleucid it's called, empire. And those guys too all seem to name themselves the same name, Antiochus. So you've got Antiochus 1 through Antiochus 4. I think there may even be an Antiochus 5 in there. But they're at war, and they are for a couple hundred years. This war lasts. So this is what the angel is detailing, is this particular war here, that they will rise up against the king of the south. That is, Egypt will be attacked. And the Syrian empire, the Seleucid empire, is the one that's largely behind it. So on the handout, after his loss at the elephant battle of Raphia, if you remember that from last week, with the Asian versus the African elephants, and even though the African ones were bigger and more aggressive, the Asian elephants won the day. Over the next 15 years, he raised a larger army. This is Antiochus, the third, I believe, also called Antiochus the Great, which another one of those names that everybody back then, every other king seems to have. You've got Alexander the Great, Antiochus the Great, Nebuchadnezzar the Great, and every king that gave his kingdom a bump up is the Great. So you've got Antiochus here. Over the next 15 years, he raised a larger army and attacked Egyptian-held territory again, also known as the Fifth Syrian War. And there are the dates, 202 to 196 BC. Ptolemy IV had died. That's the guy he beat, or that's the guy who beat him in the elephant battle at Raphia. He died in 204. His heir, Ptolemy V, was still just a child. The conflict for the throne began with the murder of Ptolemy IV's wife and sister. The regency was passed from one advisor to another, and the kingdom was in a state of near anarchy. Taking opportunity of the Egyptian anarchy, the Jews who had been paying tribute to Egypt rebelled and refused to pay. Egypt, however, was not as weak as they imagined, and their rebellion was put down. So it says again back in verse 14 in Daniel, how violent men of your own people shall exalt themselves against the king of the south. That's what happened. Evidently, the Egyptian taxation was very heavy. So the Jews naturally didn't like it. And when they saw the chaos going on, battling for who was going to be the next emperor of Egypt, they took advantage of it and just said, we're not paying. And it turns out there was some of the royalty who said, no, you've got to pay, and others that were controlling the purse that said no. And some of the ones that said you got to pay went to Egypt, paid it themselves out of their own pocket for the sake of avoiding a war. Didn't work. Egypt still came back, attacked Jerusalem, wiped out all these people who were refusing to pay, and created some real tensions between Israel and Egypt.
How did they ever get anything else done? All they did was
Fight.
Fight.
I know it.
How'd they get any social, any building done or any social thing done?
Yeah.
All they did was fight all the time.
Well, it seems, yeah. They weren't just selfish monsters. These guys are really politically savvy, and they knew well enough that there were certain groups they had to appease in the time they had it if they wanted to keep power. So it was pretty common for some of these guys, like the Antiochus in Syria, to look at this mass of people out there and figure, well, what can I do to make them happy so they're going to like me as a king and support me in case there's a rebellion? And they did a lot of, it was at this period in time when the road systems started to be built for the people. That was a huge deal, which the Romans actually copied from what the Antiochuses were doing in Syria. Rome is very often given credit for the creation of roads and such, but they learned it from the Seleucid Empire. And big building projects, big monuments, temples and things so that people could worship. So they did a lot of infrastructure things at this time in order to gain the people's favor. But you're right, sooner or later, it degenerated into some fight or war or something. It was just constant with these people. Verses 15 to 16. So the king of the north, that's the guy from Syria, Antiochus. The king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. But he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. Okay, so a conflict again, and this conflict tend to focus in the area of the Holy Land. I've got a little map there just to see where this was happening. You see the city of Sidon right along the coast there of the sea. This is the city to which the Egyptian forces lost as they were being driven out of the Holy Land. This is where they went and hid because Tyre was a heavily fortified city, had a big wall around it, strong defenses. And Antiochus wound up cornering the Egyptian army, the main force of it there, in Sidon, and laid siege to Sidon. So this is what's being described in verse 15. The king of the north, that's Antiochus, built a siege mound that was around the city of Sidon that he did that. And eventually he takes Sidon in falls 198 BC. You'll notice how close Sidon is to Jewish territory. So once on the handout here, now once it was liberated and Egypt driven back, Antiochus sought to gain the favor of the Jewish people by giving them a 3-year reprieve from paying taxes to Syria. And at the end of the 3 years, reducing the amount they paid by 1/3 from what the Egyptians were demanding. He also gave a large cash donation to the Jewish temple and released the Jewish elders, priests, and scribes and singing men from having to pay any taxes in the future. I like that. Clergy discount. There's your first clergy discount right there. Didn't have to pay taxes. So this is Antiochus the Third, also known as Antiochus the Great, who after defeating Egypt recognizes he has to gain the favor of the Jewish people because the Jewish people just revolted against Egypt. He didn't want to be dealing with a revolt on that level and a war with Egypt. So in order to appease the Jews, he says, you don't have to pay anything for 3 years. I mean, what a deal. Talk about a great way to endear yourself to the people. And then cut their tax burden by 1/3 for the future. So this was huge for Israel. And not at all surprisingly, they loved Antiochus because of it. That's going to become a bad thing for Israel, as we see. There's something said here that probably needs a little different translation than the English gives it. It says, he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. That he, that's Antiochus, the Seleucid emperor, Antiochus III, shall stand in the glorious land, that's the Holy Land, that's Israel, with destruction in his power. That's the part that's not a great English translation. You see on the handout what the words involved are. There's 2 Hebrew words involved. The first means to be complete, at an end, finished, accomplished, or spent. That's being translated as destruction. And the other one is in hand. So it doesn't necessarily mean he has destruction in hand or in his power. It simply means he has the situation completely in hand. And the way he got the situation in the Holy Land in hand was by this tax thing he did, not by threatening them with destruction. So the English translation there really is not the best we could do with the circumstances. Any thoughts or comments there?
It's just really sad that all leaders never seem to do the right thing.
Yeah, isn't it? I know it. Verse 17. He shall also set his face to enter with strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or before him. So Antiochus, he still wants to deal with Egypt. So he sets his face to enter with strength of his whole kingdom. That's Egypt. He sets his face, that is, he looks to the south, he looks to the Egyptian problem, and he asks, how am I going to fix this Egyptian thing? Because they've had 5 wars with Egypt now. And he comes up with another brilliant plan from a political standpoint. He sends his daughter to Egypt to marry Ptolemy, thinking he's going to join the families of Egypt and Syria together, and then he can control Egypt, because his daughter now is going to be queen. Problem was, the daughter winds up falling in love with Ptolemy V, the Egyptian king, and starts supporting him over her own father. So it kind of backfired on him. He didn't plan on love, which frankly was probably a pretty rare thing in those days between husbands and wives, especially these kind of power broker things, because a lot of these were arranged marriages and just political relationships. They really weren't loving homes. But this one turned into that. So Cleopatra I, who's Syrian, marries Ptolemy, who is of Macedonian heritage. They have a couple of kids. Ptolemy the 6th and 7th, surprisingly, they named them. All right, verses 18 and 19 in Daniel. After this, he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and shall take many, but a ruler shall bring the reproach against him to an end. And with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face towards the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. All right, here's the end of Antiochus. So after thinking he has Egypt dealt with the marriage of his own daughter to Ptolemy V, it says he turns his attention to the coastlands. So he looks towards the Mediterranean, and turns out not just the immediate coastlands by the Holy Land you see on the map, but coastlands that wrap around on the north side of the Mediterranean, which was a political mistake like he had never made. Because those coastlands, getting closer to Greece, were controlled by the Roman Empire. And the Romans were gaining strength at this point in history. They were a republic. They weren't the empire yet, but they still had a powerful military, and it was growing constantly. So he gets into Roman lands. Shouldn't have done that. And the Romans don't like it. And they basically rebel. So now suddenly we've got another player. And it says in the text there simply, but a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end. That's Rome, that ruler. So on the handout, here's a little more political and historical intrigue to it all. Antiochus essentially gave up on Egypt at this point and turned his attention to the coastlands along the Mediterranean. He went into areas controlled by the Romans who didn't appreciate his incursion. Rome resisted Syria at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. And at that battle, Antiochus fought with an army of 70,000 men against an army of 30,000 Romans and their allies. And yet his army was routed. That tells you something about Roman military strategy. It was even 200 years before it becomes the empire, it was still brilliant military strategy. Rome forced him to pay a tribute of 15,000 talents over a period of 12 years, surrender his elephants and his fleet, and furnish hostages, including his own son, Antiochus IV. His kingdom was now reduced to Syria, Mesopotamia, and western Iran. In 187, Antiochus, this is the third, was murdered in a Baal temple near Susa, where he was exacting tribute in order to pay the much-needed revenue. So Rome now suddenly enforces this heavy taxation on Syria to keep it in line. So it doesn't have the money enough to raise a big army again against anybody. So Syria is brought to ruin, kind of. And Antiochus III, a.k.a. the Great, is murdered as he's sacking a temple trying to get money to pay off Rome. Kind of a, ignominious end to a guy who at one time was like the head of the biggest superpower, minus Rome. All right, so and Scripture, as great as this Antiochus was, the way the Bible kind of brings his end about reveals how small a man he was. It just says, he'll stumble and fall and not be found. That's all it says. It's like we're not even going to record this guy's death. He just kind of fizzles out and comes to nothing, stumbles, falls, that's it. Yeah, he stumbled into Rome is what happened. All right, verse 20. There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. All right, Antiochus, the third successor, an older son, is named Seleucus IV. to pay heavy annual tribute demanded by the Romans, Seleucus IV is hard-pressed to find the money. He exhausted the Syrian treasury. To raise more funds, he sent his prime minister, Heliodorus, the tax collector, to plunder the temple of Jerusalem. Seleucus IV is assassinated by Prime Minister Heliodorus and is succeeded by his brother Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes is an evil man. How much is a talent? A talent is a unit of weight. And I think, off the top of my head, it was about 70 pounds. And it was used as a measure for like silver and gold. So chances are with the weights that they're talking tribute, thousands of pounds, thousands times 70 pounds, we're probably talking silver, not gold at this point.
Monetary thing, it was the weight.
It's the weight of the tribute they're bringing. Right, but which is, of course, monetary because these are precious metals we're talking about. But yeah,
It was a lot.
it was a lot. Yeah, it was more than his kingdom could sustain, so he had to sack the neighboring kingdoms to get it. Yeah, so he doesn't last long, and just like the angel told Daniel, he'll be, within a few days, he'll be destroyed. And not in anger or in battle. No, he's going to be assassinated quietly just because he doesn't last long at all. Verse 21 to 30, it's a longer section. And there's a lot of stuff here, so we're going to kind of fly through it. So I'll start in verse 21. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and be strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province. He shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. He shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. But only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south will be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacy shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go down to the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and to return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Okay. That's a lot. So the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, which out of all of these evil men, which they all were all idol-worshiping, murderous, power-hungry monsters. Antiochus is singled out by God, Antiochus IV, or Epiphanes, singled out by God as being the most vile. Politically, he's no worse than the rest. But theologically, he really is horrible. So this is what happens on the handout. The rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, 175 to 164 BC, so 11 years. While posing as the guardian and rightful heir to the Syrian throne, because he's the son of Seleucus IV. Or no, excuse me. He's the son of Antiochus III. He's the brother of the guy who was the king. So posing as the guardian of the rightful heir. Let me back up. All right, so this gets confusing because their names are all the same. The guy who didn't last long, who heavily taxed everything, the Seleucid guy, had a son. But the son was just a little kid, so he couldn't really become king. So as Antiochus Epiphanes steps up, like, tell you what, I'll take him under my wing, and I'll mentor him. And so he's supposedly caring for the next king in line. All right? And then that king kind of mysteriously dies. And it's thought that Antiochus III was probably complicit in his assassination. So then he claims the throne for himself because the rightful heir died. And this is what the text in the Bible says when it says how, let's see, he'll be strong with a small number of people. He doesn't need a military coup for this because he's doing it all slyly and slimily by killing people, little kind of behind-the-scenes assassination. Yeah, he won't be given the throne. He won't be given the honor of royalty in verse 21. He'll come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. That's what it's talking about. He was not the rightful heir, so he didn't inherit the throne rightfully. Next paragraph on the handout. He sought to calm tensions with Rome by adopting Greek culture. And this brought him into conflict with the Jews whose land he controlled. Since Antiochus III, the Jews enjoyed extensive autonomy. Remember, he cut their taxes down, he gave them a tax break, he created the clergy discount. But the Jews were divided into two parties, the Orthodox Hasidians, which means pious ones, and a Reform party that favored Greek culture. For financial reasons, Antiochus supported the Reform party, and in return for a considerable sum, permitted the high priest Jason to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem and to introduce the Greek mode of educating young people. So, again, not like his forefathers, the Bible text said. He'll gain power, but different. And the way he does this differently than his forefathers is he adopts the culture of the rising superpower, Rome. And in the Holy Land, which had been enjoying this wonderful tax break, he looks over there and sees money he needs. So he's gonna get their money slimily. And the way he does it is by introducing Greek culture into Israel. And when it says he built a gymnasium and introduced Greek education, understand how thoroughly awful that was for Jewish faith. A Roman gymnasium, gymnos is from the Greek word that means naked. The Roman gymnasium was a place where boys only, not girls, where the boys trained naked. And they were trained to let go of any of their sexual anxieties and any of their feelings of modesty, and to adopt this Greek form of education, which is sexually perverse from beginning to end. Part of the Greek education was this, it's not pedophilia, what's the other word? But where a Roman male would adopt a younger boy and teach him the finer things of culture, but rape him in the process too. That was part of Greek education. These are the things being introduced into Jewish culture. So you can imagine how the Jews, who were very modest, very pious, would have reacted to suddenly having this filthy way of life pushed into their face. Some of the Jews, not surprisingly, bought right into it. But the faithful ones, the Hasidians in this case, they rebelled, not surprisingly. In 172, for an even bigger tribute, he appointed Malanus, a Greek sympathizer, in place of Jason. This is as high priest. Malanus gave hidden temple treasures to Syria, essentially selling out the Jews. The former high priest Jason led a rebellion against him and took Jerusalem, with the exception of the citadel, murdering many adherents of his rival Malanus. A priest war. Two high priests warring with each other, murdering each other's adherents. Imagine that. When Antiochus returned from Egypt in 167, he marched against Jerusalem, massacred the inhabitants, and plundered the temple. In this, he is said to have been assassinated. In this, it is said, I think, to have been. He is said to have been. Oh, Jason. Okay, I got it. I'm with it now. That's not Antiochus. Jason had been assisted by Melanus. So Antiochus was assisted by the then sitting high priest Melanus to sack the temple and take all of its riches. So Melanus is like a traitor of the highest caliber to Israel. The fortified city, its privileges was permanently garrisoned by the Syrian soldiers. So there was a Syrian garrison now in place in Jerusalem 24/7 all the time, thanks to the sitting high priest Melanus, who was a traitor. Did what he did for money and power.
So I'm assuming that even the troubles that Israel has with Syria and all of that today probably stems from way back then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Syria is weak now. So Israel is not at all shy about blowing up some Syrian stuff now and then. But the time was when Syria absolutely controlled Israel. That's right. And all this slimy politics and power broking and buying high priests. None of the other Syrian empires tried this stuff. So this was new. And God, you can tell how God's describing this in Daniel. How he's just plain calling it vile. He has no use for this kind of slimy political intrigue stuff. All right. And when Antiochus came back into Jerusalem, it says he basically sacks Jerusalem, steals all its stuff, puts an army there, garrisons an army, and then leaves. Well, part of the reason why he was so ill-tempered was because he just got embarrassed and humiliated when he went with his army against Egypt again. Because his father's daughter, his sister, was queen in Egypt, you remember. Cleopatra was Syrian. They had 2 kids, Ptolemy, 5 and 6, I think, or 6 or 7. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, the dirtball, interjects himself into Egyptian politics because the other Ptolemy died, and now there were 2 Ptolemies who were his nephews. So he goes into Egypt trying to help one nephew that he thinks he can control over the other gain power. Well, the people who were left controlling Egypt during this power struggle called on Rome and said, hey, help us, because Syria is coming back, sticking their nose in our business again. Rome sends an army out with a general, confronts Antiochus, and says to him, we'll give you. In fact, the Roman general, it says, drew a circle around Antiochus and said, we'll give you until you step out of that circle to make a decision. And your decisions are, you go back to Syria and pay us tribute, or we'll wipe you off the planet. And he did this to Antiochus in front of his army. Total humiliation. So Antiochus agrees to pay off Rome and go home. So when he goes back through Israel, he's going home after that kind of humiliation in front of his whole army. He's got to try and do something to look better in his army's eyes. So sack Jerusalem, steal all the stuff. It's just a temper tantrum on a big scale. All right. So, okay. So now what we have on the next page, page 3, according to 2 Maccabees, it was Melanus who persuaded Antiochus to Hellenize Jewish worship and thereby brought about an uprising of Judeans under the guidance of the Maccabees, which brings us to the Maccabean War. There's 2 books in the Jewish Bible, not Jewish Bible, well, probably in the Roman Catholic Bible that are part of the Apocrypha, known as 1st and 2nd Maccabees. We don't have them because we don't consider them to be inspired. But they do give the historical record of what happened during this period in history. So in the upper 100s now. So we're less than 200 years away from the birth of Christ. So in Daniel 31 to 35, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary, the fortress, and take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purge them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Okay, so now what happens is you've got the traitor Melanius as high priest. Literally sells out Egypt, sells out Israel. And what's left are the Hasidians who are fighting him in a guerrilla war. They don't have armies yet. So at first it talks about intrigue, it talks about great exploits and lesser exploits. So it's kind of a guerrilla war at first, but it gains power. So on the handout, from 168 to 167 BC, thousands in Jerusalem were killed, and thousands more were enslaved. The city was attacked twice. New Greek governors were sent, thanks to Antiochus Epiphanes. The government seized land and property from Jason's supporters. The temple in Jerusalem was made the site of an idol to Zeus. In order to Hellenize Israel, make it Greek or Roman, they bring in a idol of Zeus and put it in the temple. And this is what in Daniel is called the Abomination of Desolation. That they'll take away the daily sacrifices and place there an abomination of desolation, verse 31. That's it. They bring in a temple of Zeus in the temple to the one true God. They no longer allow Jewish sacrifices to be made. So Antiochus IV issued decrees officially suppressing the Jewish religion. Subjects were required to eat pork, to violate Jewish dietary law, to work on the Jewish Sabbath, and cease circumcising their sons. So he just plain forbids them to practice the faith. And the brave ones refused, and the cowards who just wanted to live a peaceful life went along with it.
Can you imagine? There's so much hate.
Yeah.
There's so much hate.
It's demonic. And again, what you're seeing today with the rise of this kind of hate culture, there's always been this kind of culture out there. We've been isolated from it for quite a while, but it is demonic in origin. Okay, in the aftermath of Antiochus IV issuing his decrees forbidding Jewish religious practice, a campaign of land confiscations paired with shrine and altar building took place in the Judean countryside. And when I say shrine and altar building, I mean idols. Shrines to the false gods of Rome, idols on the hilltops to the false gods in the Promised Land. A rural Jewish priest, Matthias, of the Hasmonean family, sparked the revolt against the Syrian Empire by refusing to worship the Greek gods. Matthias killed a Jew who stepped forward to take Matthias' place in sacrificing to an idol, as well as the Greek officer who was sent to enforce the sacrifice. He then destroyed the altar. Afterwards, he and his 5 sons fled to the nearby mountains. So there's a few courageous priests. This Matthias guy was a priest, a rural priest. And a rural one. You know, God turns his attention basically to the faithfulness left on the countryside because the city is completely sold out. And the country guys are the ones who step up and refuse to bow down and fight back. And there's where your guerrilla war begins. After Matthias' death, about a year later in 166, his son, Judas Maccabeus, led a band of Jewish dissidents that would eventually absorb other groups opposed to Syrian rule and grow into an army. While unable to directly strike Syrian power at first, Judas' forces could maraud the countryside and attack Hellenized Jews, of whom there were many. The Maccabees destroyed Greek altars in the villages, forcibly circumcised boys, burnt villages, and drove Hellenized Jews off their land. Judas' nickname, Maccabee, now used to describe the Jewish partisans as a whole, is taken from the Hebrew word for hammer. So his real name is Judas the Hammer. What a great title. Judas the Hammer.
They're all WWE wrestling.
Yeah, right. That's a good wrestling name. Toward the end of the summer of 165 BC, Antiochus IV departed from Babylonia in the eastern half of his empire and left Lysanias in charge of the western half as regent. Shortly afterwards, the Maccabees won a substantial victory at the Battle of Emmaus. A large Syrian army was sent to quash the revolt. During this time, Antiochus IV died in Persia. The Syrian troops then returned to Syria. The Maccabees entered Jerusalem in triumph. They ritualistically cleansed the temple and reestablished traditional Jewish worship there. So the Maccabees is a big deal and a turning point in history for the Jews. This ends the Syrian influence once and for all. Syria will never again gain power after this. And the Jews are largely responsible for it. They frustrated him, refused to bow down to the false gods, and they cleansed their land. So the Maccabean revolt represents really a national turning point for them. Any comments or thoughts? Now, in Daniel's prophecy, this also represents something else. From here on out, the rest of this chapter, even though it's talking about kings of the north and the south, isn't really talking about kings of the north and the south. The historical part of what the angel reveals to Daniel ends at this verse, at verse 35. Now, everything in the rest of this chapter becomes symbolic. And it turns out that this war between Antiochus IV against the temple, where he introduces idolatry into the temple, and the Maccabees reverse that, this becomes symbolic of end times for the angel, as he tells Daniel. So this is like what it will be in the last days. Evil people will seemingly overcome the good, they'll establish their power, but God's goodness will war with them and win in the end. So it's that dynamic of evil establishing itself as a power and good ultimately winning in the end that becomes a symbol of the rest of history. So the angel stops with the historical detail from this verse. And what you got after this now talks about the end times, our times, frankly. Before we get to that, though, just a note on the death of Antiochus Epiphanes. This is what's quoted in the book of Maccabees. This is how the Jews say he died. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and invisible blow. As soon as he stopped speaking, he was seized with pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures, and that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many strange inflictions. Yet he did not in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews, and giving orders to drive even faster. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Thus, he who only a little while before had thought in his superhuman arrogance that he could command the waves of the sea and had imagined that he could weigh the high mountains in balance, was brought down to the earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms while he was still living in anguish and pain. His flesh rotted away, and because of the stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. There's God's justice on this world, even on this plane, for a man who warred with God. So quick note, and then we're going to have to stop there. A hint of this transition in thought that I told you, where now it goes into something symbolic. A hint comes at the end of verse 35 when it says, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. So it's like that's your marker that now what's coming is about the end, for that appointed time at the end of things. Yeah, let's see. Previous, okay. So what happens under Antiochus the Fourth is a sign of what's going to happen at the end. Note that Daniel's other visions also ended with the coming Antichrist. This is no different than anything else we've seen in Daniel in that sense. All of the other visions had an image of an Antichrist at the end. Some figure who would coalesce evil and war against the truth of God and the children of God. Every one of Daniel's prophecies points to an Antichrist. And this one is no different. This one now is from the mouth of an angel, but it too points to an Antichrist, which is what we'll start with next week. Any thoughts, questions, or comments on this? All right, so that will be the end of all of this historical detail, so you can breathe a sigh of relief. You won't have to endure all that again. But
You're at the end of a movie where you've got all this, like,
yeah.
now it can't.
You can't get the punch. You got to wait a week for the punchline. Yeah. All right, let's.
Or they have a movie and it's meant for other movies to be made.
Right.
And they never make the other movie.
All right, let's close with prayer then. Heavenly Father, we know that every detail of what is to be is known to you and seen by you and planned by you for our good and our protection. We pray that you would comfort us with the knowledge that you do hold all things in your hand and we are safe in your keeping and you will preserve us by the grace given us here in your church. For Jesus' sake, amen.